very interesting that we were also discussing the other day until you find it about this artist in France who goes inside the museum and takes a piece of art, and he doesn't go out, he's not stealing it, but to just kind of bring,
Performance.
to bring into, like, to bring to the light the African collections in, all these different museums, and the idea that, oh, we can't, African museums can't protect them, so they need to be in European museums. So there's a lot of, it's very interesting how art can also push the boundaries of what museums do. And so through using art installations to have these conversations, it's very cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, also another work in regard that's similar to this is Iwiwi. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah.
The Chinese artist. He's quite what he was doing when he got very rich in Germany. He's like very nice. He said like Germany capitalized on him as a political refugee from China, and he capitalized on them to be a famous artist. And one of the things that he did, he was buying a very expensive antiques or objects that represent nation states from museum, and then he was breaking them.
Yeah, that famous photos, like just dropping out.
Yeah. Like thousands of euros object that he bring them, and he's actually, by this artistic practice, he say like they are meaningless.
But he's doing this in China too, and in China that very important porcelain stuff was sold out 1 cent. So he was criticizing how Chinese people do not take care of their culture.
Yeah. He was, but also he had a lot of critics on the conservations of nation state for objects, because he's coming from this like contemporary art movement, because he teaches style the same in ODK, his university together, and about the fact of that like most of them, they are resembling. This is not necessarily anti-colonial perspective, but it's automatically coming as anti-colonial perspective by criticizing museums and discourse of nation state. And I think another artist which is really famous, not an artist, he's a creator, and he's also interested in architecture. He's from Cameroon, and he's also based in Berlin, and you never also can check his work. His name is Bonaventure. And he make a place called Savvy Contemporary, and basically it's called the Laboratory for Contemporary Art. And what he's basically doing, in addition to the movement of he's doing what he call it contemporary art, but non-Eurocentric contemporary art. A part of it criticizing museums and historical structures, and now they are leading part of this movement of anti-Humboldt Forum. And Humboldt Forum is a project of Germany now that they want to celebrate its history, which is not pride at all. That they want to make this Humboldt Forum, which is a big, massive museum project with a lot of objects from all over the world. And a lot of objects that they have is object that extracted from Namibia through the colonial era, and from Tanzania as well. And Anti-Humboldt Forum is an intellectual architect movement, Berlin anti-colonial activists, and they're organizing a lot of like massive demos and artistic practices against that project. In fact, they represent the movement of like a very politically responsible contemporary art movement against the old nation state conserving and colonial extractions of other people objects from all over the world and saving them and presenting them in the European context. So I think you can also follow that movement. They are really, I think Berlin it is the perfect place for your project, actually.
Yeah. We were planning to be in contact with some initiatives based in Berlin. They are also producing like diasporic thinking and minorities.
Yeah.
We will check this one. But I think another point is I really appreciate that political responsibilities, but I would be curious if they were open to be involved in the initiative, like very how to say, like very leading team if there are representative people from the other culture, because like representation of otherness in the collection or in the object level is okay. It's almost like currently marketable and something very demanded, but were they really also including the communities, local people and initiatives from that certain geographies?
Actually, exactly that what they do. They are really having a very, because this movement when it started of like German Namibian colonial history, that's something's really forgotten in Germany. They don't want to talk about it. That the movement is started by some German anti-colonial activists, but recently that the Berlin postcolonial movement is actually run by an old Namibian professor, and he's also from the Herero, not from the Namama. It's like actually the tribe that subjugated to German genocide in Namibia, and he's here in Germany, and he's one of the leader of the movement. Bonaventure that I told you about, he's Cameroonian as well, which is, one of the things is also that part of our responsible conversation as people coming from like Near East or Global South, or what is defined based on European, is to say that we cannot actually trace actual owners of these objects, no? Like you cannot care, like for example, the ownership of it is also replaced by nation state. If you talk about, it's not a Namibian ownership. This object is in that time extracted from a special civilization. It's called Hariri and Namama, which is now they are tribe according to the modern definition. So they are not really a nation. They have legitimacy to. So if you get this object back, you get it to the nation back, and that is actually coming to the other topic. Is properly, I think you already researched about it. Is the African Museum in Dakar, which is Chinese funded project.
Yeah.
It's one of the, I think you know it, no?
Yeah. The one in San.
And then part of it, there was this discourse of like, now we have a museum and we need our object back.
Yeah. There's also in Nigeria.
Yeah. And then it is quite progressive Pan-Africanist idea, but when you're very, very critical to even the construction of identity over myth, that actually there's a lot of change happening in that area. Based on colonialism, conflict, civil war, nation state, and conflict between nation state. If I'm giving stuff from Namibia to Senegal, who is the ownership of that place? Is that the Senegalese government that to activate tourism, was it?
Yes.
Or neoliberal nation states were actually part of international economic system already, or the communities, like what you ask, yeah.
Also, I think it's very interesting in the perspective of, for example, nations that were places where the borders and the boundaries have people who are from, both sides. For example, you have Nubian culture between Egypt and Sudan, or you have the Kurdish culture between, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And so even when you come to talk about, like we're saying, the ownership of these pieces and them going back, who does they actually go to? Do they see like which city it came from and then they just try to return it there? And so it does create a very interesting discussion to how do we go into the depths of defining what the ownership is of these pieces, or if the nations own them or not.
But
also it's a kind of excuse to like creating more time to not to giving back at the end, like it doesn't still has to stay in the British Museum.
No, in fact, of like there's a two layers on it. What is, they actually don't want to give it back anyway, but when we talk about that, because sometimes we actually criticize what they created through history, but at the same time, that the alternative, when we look at post-colonial studies, they look at European also as well, the post-colonial studies that exist now. It is not look at the impact of post-colonial nation states on on the colonial subject itself or the nation. It was actually just Amber has mentioned that, for example, that this is modern nation state itself. It is like what you say, for example, that is now producing a present conflict, you know, and some post-colonial studies looking at the colonial violence as a past. They are not looking, for example, as the crisis of Tawarik that is dividing among 7 nations, mostly 4 nations in Algeria, in Mali, in what's called it in Niger and Mali and Algeria and Libya, and they mainly enter a civil war until 2006 for different 4 uprising for their own nation state. And that was actually very connected to the culture that produced now. For example, the Tinariwin, this famous band from northern Mali, is a revolutionary who looking for self-autonomy for the Tawarik for a long time. But that make it very because also Tawarik, they internalizing certain kind of colonial history, so because part of their war legacy of those slave cannot govern us. Our former slave cannot govern us. Although their problem is with the nation state, with a new form of modern state that's created by colonial, but it's still they're using colonial cultural perspective of colorism.
Yeah, exactly.
And racism. And it is a very complex trait that all the time requires studies that I think that probably makes you not just be an activist, you decided to make a think tank. Activist think tank. So you understand that you're addressing any topic as a complex topic. Not you cannot just say one line on it, saying that, for example, let's get our objects back. But then when you talk about objects back, it's actually if you get a Libyan object back and put it now in Libya, you're gonna erupt a civil war actually, because everybody will say it is my object. And then you have how many thousands of cultural groups saying that they have an ownership over history now based on the civil war. You know, it is so it comes from this idea like museum of nation state in Europe is constructed over othering,
Yes.
produce the identity of the nation state itself, but museum in the global south, in the Near East, is violence. Because museum itself, like for example, Ahmed can elaborate on that more, that museums in Sudan are more concerned with what you call it, the Nile civilizations, which is like Kosh and Merowi and also until Mamlakat Sinnar, which is the first Islamic whatever, or the blue Mamlakat Sinnar, the Blue Nile civilization. But they are ignoring Taju, Tunju, and this is already civilization before Darfur in the West Sudan. They're ignoring the Baliamiyin, which is the Eastern Hadandawa and the Eastern. They are ignoring them because they are not actually Sudanese, but they are Ethiopian, but they are Eritrean, but they are Sudanese, because the nation, the definition, the conscious that we have it about nation state, it is not aligned with our idea of museum, that we cannot just produce museum, because the time that I produce museum, then I decide that this is the nation, this is the nation, and that produce, okay, I'm part of that nation and I have gun, so either I get my own nation by myself or I'm gonna kill you. And that is actually showing that actually museum, it is a tool, it's a tank, I'm not a tank for thinking, it's a tank for an actual tank of violence. So,
and also I think it comes from, with the idea of taking modern, like, because when they created the nation states, the post-colonial nation states, they wanted to go so far with the idea of modernity and creating a modern state. And so they took whatever was considered Western and modern as it is without having a critical point of view to it. And so museums were, byproduct of that, where in Sudan, for example, we have an ethnographic museum, which makes no sense, where in the Western world they try to define the different ethnicities and do the hierarchies, but why would that be an example in Sudan? And that came not just in museums, but also in the way like the urban city was divided, the languages, everything. But the museum is a reflection of that, of how A modern state was for them the ideal that they wanted to go to, without any critique of what was those modern states built on and how they were also built on, colonial ideas, and that was very problematic for our nation.
But I didn't understand one thing. Why ethnographic museum is problematic?
Because most of the ethnographic museums were done in a way that reduced peoples and cultures into very simplistic forms. And so you would have, for example, Native Americans or, African, pygmies from certain tribes, or people from, I don't know, Sudan. And they would just represent them to things that were very superficial and that were stereotypical. And so you would see the way they would dress, the way they would represent themselves, which doesn't give an in-depth analysis on who those people are. And so it's very, the way they were done in European museums. Even now there was a whole article about, how people need to get over ethnographic and anthropological museums, even because they were done in a big way to other those people. And so you'd have like those headdresses that come from a certain culture, or these things that were perceived as costumes or imagery. Whereas in Sudan, for example, we have hundreds of tribes that can't be represented in just these certain, glimpses that were done in the way ethnographic museums were.
That's what I exactly didn't understand. So the category of ethnographic museum is not problematic. It's the way they made it, no?
Yeah, I think that's the same when we say about Orientalism. It's a discipline, it's a colonial discipline that's created in a particular time. But for example, that you don't go in Germany and you have something is called the German, the Gulu, the tribes that used to live here in the Roman Empire somehow. The way that they describe it is basically, the way that they describe it, but in the same time, they created narrative that it could be described, Like this discipline, scientific discipline, is called ethnographic, or also anthropology, by the way. The two of them is the same like Orientalism. They used to be a discipline that Oriental studies is a discipline in universities until now, But how Oriental studies now developed after Edward Said critics, for example, is the same when you say about ethnography. There's a lot of people who are anti-colonial in the ethnographical descriptions, but it's still the same colonial ethnographical descriptions, or like describing people as objects. And this is actually contradict with this, what they call it, modern anthropology. Like I think, what his name is, French anthropologist, the object. Is this French guy. He has a really nice book about analyzing cultures in a way that instead of describe them as static objects, as part of them, as we go there and describe the tree, and describe they are not like an active agent, are not also dynamic cultures that have come from certain kind of civilization coming up and down. It's just describing them the same like animal, how they wear, how they eat and how they drink, and what is their food and how they look. And this is objectifying what they call the colonial subject in this way. And it comes from an old, also this, that part of this practice in the ethnographic, it used to be in Europe, was called the human zoo, which is they take people from, they did it in Sweden, they did it in Germany, it's very famous. It's also.
But I'm not sure if they are corresponding the same time frame. Because what I understand from there's an amazing ethnographic museum in Turkey, and it's like very comprehensive, very well studied about ancient civilization in Mesopotamia, and I think it would be a bit, disgrading comparison of animal zoo. And plus, it's like you feel like the museum should make you feel it's purely scientific. They are not the artifacts from that time. No, that's about lifestyle. And with lots of data should propose. But animal zoo, it's like
it's not an animal zoo. No. It's not animal zoo. It's human zoo. It's called
human zoo. Sorry, it was like on purpose colonial project, and people were literally curious about how a black-skinned person would look like. And even a like very early time, like period of British Museum, who was the guy Hans Solane, and he was like wearing clothes made out of black skin, and still in the UK they are like promoting this guy. He was amazing. He was the founder of modern museology. So
No, but
I think like when
difference between the one you were talking about and the ethnographic museums you were talking about is you mentioned something very critical. You were saying in ancient times. And so the difference between the ethnographic museums we were talking about and the ones about ancient is that they didn't portray those people as in ancient times. They literally put people that were now living and their representation as ethnographic museum. Like even parts of those ethnographic museums had world fairs where they literally brought people from all these villages around the world and put them in a village. For example, I remember there was one in Paris, and people would come and see them. And so from a historical perspective, trying to study ancient civilizations or ancient people and folks and ethnicities and looking into it, in a way could not be problematic, but the way ethnographic museums developed in the other sense, where they literally had, like I said, superficial representation of cultures now were problematic, like people from Papua New Guinea or people from Aboriginal Australians. And so
okay, no, I think I have 2 points. One is like, let's say Memluki, how to say, civilization. If we want to represent today in the ethnographic museum, is not as problematic as you are showing a tribe currently
in the Amazon
present. Okay. Plus, it's like Memluki Museum in Abu Dhabi or Khartoum, or I don't know, somewhere in Syria, wouldn't be as problematic as in Paris, right?
Yeah.
But when we think of the timeline, like it is okay for me to be in the category of ethnographic museum and with many scientific support and historical perspective.
Now, there's two parts of it. Firstly, the first part of it is like ethnographical in a term of present. I think in the term of study, actually, also, I don't know if Mamluki could be, because, for example, Mamluki was different ethno groups, you know?
Yeah, I just randomly, yeah.
For example, but that's exactly, it's also in itself, it's coming from the idea of all of these disciplines. In fact, they are product of colonial studies and colonial universities that externalized and built over other countries, no? And then they took the same surplus or curriculum, and then they're actually teaching it in that places. Studying cultures itself and defining in this ethnographic as objects, you know, not as actually an agency, that groups with the agency, and then put them as more aesthetic. Their beauty, their standard, like the Ambaradan and stuff like this. Like what, for example, this French German Nazi photographer who went to Nubia, Leffner style, for example, who took photo of Nubian. We still use these photos. They're very important and good because it actually show us a history of the place. But that photos, it's presented in a very form of racist ideas. The other part of it is still also the same one of historical ethnographic also. It has a problematic part of it, especially what you said, for example, this conflict of studying history and trying to construct the conscious of the nation state through that history by the state funding certain kind of ethnographic projects. For example, the Egyptian, they're celebrating the Mamluki in their conflict with the Ottoman, as now they bringing it at their conflict with the Muslim Brotherhood and their conflict with Turkey. And they created from it, because of that, now actually Mamluki projects or studying Mamluki project, because they fought in Sultan Selim with this fight. He had it with this guy, the last Mamluki, before they've been actually killed by Muhammad Ali Pasha later on, which he wasn't Ottoman. They are celebrating celebrating that, and they're funding this kind of project.
Mm-hmm.
The same, for example, with a now Egyptian, for example, going to extract bodies, or like going to show that the mummies, these mummies, is belong to the Egyptian who's living in Egypt now.
Yeah.
Which is in fact, mummy, like the Pharaoh civilization is longer than all of our modern and past history since the birth of the Christ, that we call it. You know, they are from different places. They had Suric leaders. They had Nubian leaders.
Mm-hmm. They had
and also for example, and they had also Roman leaders. You know, like, and they have not just Roman. What's his name? Alexander. Some of the family of Alexander was part of, which is what they call Cleopatra. She wasn't from Africa originally. She's but that's exactly that. Studying this ethno culture as objects and put them in the museum as voiceless. This is for now, for the present, is a very colonial discipline about studying the others.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how put the other in the context. But in our nation-state critics, which is a byproduct of the colonialism itself, that it's also used, this ethnographic museum used to create the myth, which is Sheikh and you call it the myth of civilizations, that we had a civilization. And I think for that, I really recommend a very interesting book from Sheikh and Diouf. It's called The African Myth and Civilization. He's talking about, he actually entered this fight of like the pharaohs were black, and it was, and Fanon was criticizing him, was like, hey, we don't want to go in the past. Our present is our civilization. Our fight against colonialism is civilization. And this is to a school of Pan-Africanism that was very important. But Sheikh Anta Diop wrote about that, exactly about, like, we cannot say in the end also the pharaohs who they are, because the concept of colorism that we have it now, we cannot read it. And that's exactly when we read, when you criticize museology, for example, and all of these disciplines, so that how we read the history of the problematic conscience that we have it now, with the same hierarchy, who was the leader, who was, and that exactly is conflict now in the Middle East about the Parisian, the Ottoman, the Parisian, the Ottoman, the Pharisine, I don't know, it's in English, Persian, yeah, and the Ottoman and the Islamic civilization, like who is the dynasties, and this is actually justified by ethnographic museums and statements that created now about that history. It make us as a kind of modern subject, we wanted to liberate it from this ideology. Is difficult because somebody will come with the scientific knowledge telling me, no, this area is owned by the Tawarik since 2,000 years ago, but Ibn Khaldun wrote before 2,000 years ago. They came with Tariq ibn Ziyad in the campaign against, all of this very strange idea. It is not, it's good to read it, it's good to have it, but to create that what you wrote in your manifesto, that's criticizing the academic tools, which is itself, what Foucault said, that power in knowledge is disappearing. That sometimes when we submit to knowledge and we say it's good, we actually submit certain kind of power behind it, which is the power creating our conscious of today. This is historical constructivism of reality, that today Sudan is the Nubian civilization. It is not. The Nubian Jamal, they are not the Nubian. And Muntasir did this research about that. And I think this is the first step to criticize this institution, is to look at it critically. Yes, we read it. Yes, we find it nice input.
Exactly.
But we construct what Stuart Hall called our own conceptual maps. That when we look at these topics, we don't just say, this is reality, this is our history. No, it's actually, this is history that we could look at, the critical approach toward history that create the representation of today. And
gonna just talk about that because when I was reading the article that was criticizing ethnographic museums, one of the things that I was talking about was also the way history was viewed. And so, critiquing history is very interesting because also the idea, and we discussed this one time in our curatorship course, of viewing history as linear, and so putting a hierarchy to it. So now, as the way ethnographic museums were developed in Europe was how that European culture was at the top of the hierarchy because they developed into this point of civilization, where other tribes and folks and people were still in the bottom, where they were in their savage state as they were considered at that time. And so that's why even in ethnographic museums, which was very interesting, there's no representation of cultures at that point. There's nothing that says this is how a Swiss family is right now, or this is what a German family is, but there is this representation of these tribes because those people in this state are, like you were saying, an object to view, and it's very interesting and peculiar. And so also critiquing history and how
I am not agreeing that point, because I don't know if Swiss family, but in Holland and in UK there are like farms and showing. Okay, after postmodernism, there's nothing to define.
I'm saying the ethnographic
but
museum
like from 18th, 19th century, there was that's also as problematic as ethnographic museums. But can I continue just a little more? I think we are so agreed with Ahmed, but in our manifesto, what we meant for like being critical is okay, let's make museums, but the time machine approach is very problematic. It comes from a single perspective, and the perspective defined by who has the powers. So museums can have certain collection or like collection of data to propose, but it should always end the viewer with many thoughts and should be open certain critical and feedback, because one of the problematic side is there's no, like, it's very one directional informative transmission. And imagine some museums has like animating how to say rooms that you enter and you completely feel how the war was, how the people were living, with even smell and the earthquake and everything. So it's like the experience you had push your brain to believe whatever was shown in the museum experience. But when you live, like, you just feel either sense of nostalgia or a second-hand nostalgia, or with new information, as you said, like approved by a certain institution. Exactly. It was like super scientific, I must believe. So instead of like ethnographic museums, for us, like, it's not as a category, it shouldn't be as problematic, but there must be a room for feedback and dialogue and criticism, and even inside the collection, like maybe with many question marks, at least like certain room for other like interpretation for the future.
Yeah, totally. What you say is one of the things, the experience of Germany, of how they want to present the collection of Nazi time. Because there is a public, this is the only thing that at least Europeans admit that there's problematic in their history, very collectively, and somehow all of the political strata and the elite, and also the and the movement from the left to the right admit that what they did in history is wrong. So basically what they have to present in how they can present that era. This is like 10 years or something like that. So how they present all of these collections that actually, what they did is, okay, we're going to present it. We cannot just, because we don't want people to forget that. We want people to, even the problematic part of it. But then they put this with famous notes that they, in everything, that this collection is from the Nazi time, and it is, but they already put their ideological stand from it, no? Like they say, for example, this collection is quite problematic, extract based on racism and ideologies that Germany is trying to reject and whatever. And they put a big notes on it. For example, you find it in Hygiene Museum in Dresden, Hygiene Museum, where they have a lot of Nazi collection where they talk about human bodies and how it looks and stuff like that. So now what you're bringing here, which is what I really love about the project, is we need to not present just like a tag on the collection. We need to present a critical discourse, a movement of talks and discussions, which is contemporary art somehow did that, but they're represented by other visual representation, which is called the present, the contemporary, in a way. You know, this is what Preuss and most of the cultural critics, they do, is stuff like some of them took the same objects and they're moving it with a critical approach of today. Some of them forget about it and present in front of them a performance or stuff like this. But what you are putting here is more about like, okay, you know, the artistic practice is right and we're going to do artistic practice, but let's have a discussion about it. And it's not just breaking it down. And it brings me to, again, I think I want to talk to you also about how you're positioned from the statues, that now there's a movement to bring all of the statues that represent certain kind of colonial history or racist history. Is that right to break them down and to bring them down? Or it is right actually to keep them there and to present a sustainable conversation and discussions through what you do, like think tanks, papers, like it has to be there, reminding people this history. Because if we pick that history and delete it from people's mind, we're actually deleting a memory of violence that could be repetitive in itself. And that is not also, and also the other thing that Ahmed says is it is about this idea of like the chronological way of looking at history as a linear, and also another concept which is called the selective memory. That who decides that memory is a memory, you know. And then whatever we do, whatever we try to create museums, we're gonna fall in the problematic thing about we're gonna use our ideological selective memory about history, even if we want to be inclusive and to expand history and to say it's a complex, it's still we're gonna pick because this is history of thousands of years that we just know, and then we actually don't know all of it, and we don't know even 10% of it, but then we expand it to make it more 15% of representation of minorities and stuff like that. But this is still a selective memory, and I think in that topic there's this the guy who worked in the collective and selective memory. It was Patrice Guzman from Chile. He did the famous movie is called Battle of Chile, and the Battle of Chile is a day where Pinochet, the military leader, made his coup against Salvador Allende, and he has his camera in the street and he shot all of the video. But then he didn't know how to present that, because also he understands this is a violence and this is our history and stuff like that, but how I present it. So he decided to show it to the generation of 1989 anti-constitution revolution that actually bring Pinochet down, and then to document that moment. Just document that moment, not actually showing. And then he published Battle of Chile, but then he showed the videos of the reaction of the people of 1991 to create that what you presented in a form of dialogue and discussion and conversation, and all the time open for interpretation and critics, but it's not actually a historical fact, because we will not use the same tools that nation states do to create our countries. And yeah.
I think the important aspect for us is that we don't want to come and state that we're creating new knowledge and saying like this is the new way. No, but what we want to do is open conversations and dialogues about how do we view these things, how do we view history, and we want to have conversations with different people, even people who we could disagree with or agree with, but we want to have a conversation about this, because it is more important than just stating, okay, this historical fact was wrong and this is the fact, because like you said, this is something that would put us into a wormhole, like a hole of always trying to discover, and there's no, factual, there's no thing that we can put like this is it. And so for us, it was very important to have conversations that are from a critical perspective and to just open them. And so I totally agree with you.
And I think what we are trying to do with this think tank project is, because creating a dialogue is not we discovered, like it's highly discussed in the academic circles in these days, but we are more trying to be alert to the danger of, like as you said, all the museum can decide to give a disclaimer and get rid of this all the problem. And because things become so in the in the age of political correctness, things become so marketable so fast, or the representational problems try to be solved without an ideological point. Okay, you come, Africans, like all that problems we are trying to go a bit deeper and maybe provocative. So like our point is literally not to find anything, any proposal to solution, because we are just two and like work capacity is obvious, but we can produce some critical thoughts and to make things harder. And also I think it's important we invite people to like collectively think about the power of and significance of and the role of museums in the society. So if we don't give that much of power, it wouldn't collectively affect us that much, because the museum is not the only single amazing way to learn stuff. There are like multiple resources, and they are equally can be important.
And another point with the statues that you said, like, I don't think we had a discussion specifically about them, but when you asked the question, I was just thinking about how, if you imagine like these statues were just taken down very silently and without anyone knowing, and governments all decided to have them, instead of the conversations that happened around why these statues were problematic. Like, for example, in Belgium, where a lot of people would say, like, we did not know the problematic history of King Leopold, I don't know which number he was, in what happened in Congo. And now I was noticing that with the conversations of the statues, for me, what was more important, like for me personally, was the conversations that were happening around those statues of why are they presented now? What did these people do? Is what they did acceptable or not? Is more important than the fact of them disappearing, because it is very important to have these conversations about why were these people there? Why were they problematic? Why were they celebrated for things that would be considered very problematic? Like, for example, in the US, it was very interesting for me to discover that some of these statues that were done for the Confederate soldiers were done in the 50s, 100 years after, the end of the Civil War. And so, having a conversation of why did the southern states or these states decide to put these statues 100 years later? Did it have to do with what was happening with the civil rights movement? Was it a reaction? It's very important to have them instead of just the actual physical act of getting rid of it. And that's the thought that just came to me. Wow.
Actually, it is very interesting, because the same, like you talk about that they created actually years after those people actually already being exposed in the world as a bloody cells to people, but it's still they were celebrating them a certain kind of period of time. And what's interesting me, especially about King Leopold, that I feel like what they are doing with the statue of King Leopold now is making not people just don't look at history, is erasing the way that we look at the present. So the same problems that Congo had is a diamond, that King Leopold was cutting people's hands for mining, and now people are dying or mining by also European weapons. And this present, that people are not looking at it, because mostly the investor companies, Belgian, British companies, is still working there, erupting civil war, and then it leads to death a lot of people. And because people are not looking at that history, they look at it like King Leopold, he was a wrong guy. We're just gonna throw that study down, but they don't look at him as an ideological and social framework that to understand how those people are thinking until now, how people are actually thinking about Congo, about this faraway place that they bring for us, diamond, Calton. We use it for a smartphone now, and then people could die of it without seeing. And it's also in the age of, like, I think sometimes also what Esther said about like the political correction thing, in a way that, okay, now we get rid of colonial history in the frame of European context of, like, so the people from Black descent in Europe, they don't feel offended, but it's still the same people actually King Leopold killed in that geographical area is actually killed for the same reasons until now. And it is somehow that exactly what about the critical approach is opening conversation about that historical era and why, because King Leopold, he didn't actually cut the people's hand by himself. He ordered that, but there was massive amount of killing used also by local Congolese soldiers who used the colonial narrative. So the colonial ideology that exists and disappeared inside behind the power, like in power is still running it. So then we want to criticize that power. We need to bring that history and to see it and to have a conversation about it. So we need to give that guy in and tell them what actually how that happened, how that guy happened, and what's happening now is related to this guy ideology. You know?
And it's very important to see how people for so many years ignored it because they were, you know, benefiting from it at the same time. And so it was easier for them to pretend that it was not happening, like you were saying, it's happening now. And so a lot of the time, like these conversations are had in a way that is to, in the name of also political correctness and to protect those. And in the same time, like there was this very interesting TikTok. It was so funny on the side. And so one guy was like, I don't care what you say in your country, but it affects me with what is happening right now in Colombia. I don't care what people in the US say about, you know, what Colombians are or their presentation, but what is happening right now in Colombia is more important to me. And so it is very important to see that these things are not just in the past and not just in like historical narratives, but are things that are continuing to this day, and their effects are happening in the present. And so I think your point is very important to look at.
Yeah. And that's bringing us to the thing. It's not, they call it post-colonial. They don't call it decolonialization.
Yeah.
So it is somehow, we need to talk about this era as history and not look at actually kind of a new kind of capitalist extraction of wealth from with all over the world. And it is somehow seen in that narrative of like, it's just post-colonial. So it's actually impacted on the identities that living in Europe, but it's not impacting in the present structures of economy of the world. And I think this is also a perspective. It's a good also perspective of the identity. They have to come together in one conversation and dialogue. And that what makes me like, for example, until now, people talk about the history of the internet. If you go to any country, they have some scientists in their history. Like now the British, they make the $50 over this photo of this crypto scientist from the Second World War as the first invention of the computer.
Yeah.
And
something Turin, I think, the guy who was kidnapped.
Yeah. And one of the famous thing about that is it's just like everybody, if you go to Russia, they tell you like Viktor Gorbachev is the first one who created the radio transmitting through informations and crypto transmission, so cybernetic. And when you go to Britain, you have this, and the Americans, they say we created the computer. So but in a way that, because they look at it from perspective of like, actually this history is not a line, not somebody is like, this science was growing and people come to certain kind of result in different kind of time, and that need a conversation, it need a dialogue. You know, the computer is owned by a collective memory of science, of people everywhere is actually who are participating on it. But now you want to say like our nation made it. It is,
And I think
actually we were also referencing like Marxist rhetoric, like the time cannot be like linear, it is circular or helizonic. Like one of our point was, I don't know if you mentioned in our manifesto, but like the linear timeline is so like made up in the Renaissance and Western Enlightenment discourses, but that's not the case, and some languages even don't perceive time as a linear, like not as English, like it's completely circular.
And I think it's also very interesting is that how we try to, you know, use these same methods. And that's why I always have these discussions when people try to enforce these colonial concepts or these concepts that people should fight to try to explain themselves. For example, when there is insistence on differentiating people based on race, where in the end it's something that is a concept that is arbitrary and that didn't come until the transatlantic slave trade. Or now I have this discussion with people of which civilization was first or who did this first. And I always end up with the question is like, why does it matter? It's something that is in the collective, history and memory. It's something that affects us all. And there's always this discussion of nothing comes out of the blue. Like the human history is built on everyone's experiences and the exchange of cultures, like we're saying in the beginning of the conversation, and how science, for example, or history, or these things develop not linearly, but things on top of each other that happen parallelly in different civilizations. But there's still an insistence of trying to prove who was first or who was best, even though historically these places aren't related to those nations. But it's important, for example, for someone from, I don't know, Sudan, to prove like, oh, the first people were in Sudan, although you as a Sudanese now probably don't inhabit the same, place of those people 1,000 years ago. They were probably different people, different folks. They went into the future. So it's also important to try and, I don't know, like construct or to look at all these different terminologies, all these different ideologies, and are they, beneficial now, or are they important for the conversation, or how do we look at these things from, a different perspective and not just take these concepts as a given and move on with them.
Yeah.
I don't know if I explained.
No, you explain well, and I think also when we consider erased part of the history, we like there are some informative gaps, and we need to fill them up with proper political understanding. So, like another famous Marxist saying that, like, you cannot know or prove scientifically everything now, but with a consistent ideology, you can have a better estimation.
Yeah.
I don't think you use the word estimation. I'm just trying to translate them.
Yeah.
No, but I think, it affects all different categories, but we're sticking now to culture, history, and art, but it can go into science or math and all of these different categories. I was talking to my dad that they were doing a movie called like Science at Dawn or something. And so it was also talking about how, like the insistence of, the scientific method and the idea of science was only created, with the scientific revolution, of 1500s. Then we have all these conversations about, the Arabs in the, in the golden Arab age, or the Greeks, or before it, the Egyptians, or, different times. But we were having this discussion also that the insistence on naming things, like things need to be named and defined at a certain specific time, because then it doesn't work. And that comes again back to purity of things need to be clean and clear. You can put them inside a box. They can't be something that's overlapping and moving. And so it's also...
Yeah, actually, this is, I think also last in our meeting, I told you about this interesting book from Stuart Hall, no? The Theory of Representation. Of the constructions of meaning and names and naming stuff, and how it's impacting he's talking about it from media perspective, that media create the meanings and the representation of us because they need to name stuff, and this naming and meaning is creating a certain kind of violence. And also it's kind of making this conflict in history, that what I say about like history is a conflict, as the Marxism series, history is conflict. No, history is not one linear line. And this, he said that it's creating history by making it static, by naming it. It's not moving, and I think it's really interesting research book. It's actually more of a, it's also giving you, like, he's not really quoting even, he's making readings in after every chapter, that to read other people what they think about it. And I like the way he present that book, because also he brought the conflictly understanding of history. Like he brought Foucault and Marx in a place together, and then he was actually not saying that I'm whiz or whiz, but I'm reading that through this conflict, also theoretical perspective. I think it's really, really nice book for the think tank. You need to have it as a book in your library somehow. Did you start creating library?
Planning to have like an extensive reading period.
Yeah.
Yeah. After in the next following months, because we have to, catch up with a lot of things, and so definitely that is going to be one of the books that we have to read on.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about, because now when I'm speaking to you, two of you, I like your ideas is very grounded, but it's not showed in the manifesto.
Yeah.
So what I think the manifesto is too, like I told you last time, is too little for what you actually were intending to do or thinking about. And I think before publishing it, you need to expand it in a way that including all of this like kind of one-to-one, two-to-two conversation that you are making with people, even when you answer to them. Like I see now when you actually answer or reply or elaborate on a topic, ideas has to be written there in the manifesto somehow. Because
we made it on purpose. It's like a bit vague because we're afraid like in the future our direction can be a little changed.
But we were thinking of having a section of discourses. I haven't shared with you the new website. And so let me just share it with you now. I've learned, but the discourse part still we didn't do. But we had an idea of whenever we have a kind of conversation like the one we had now, we could have a writing, like we write something, we publish something under our discourse section, because like she said, we were very afraid of not knowing where, like, well, of course we have ideas already because of our discussions for a long time and all of these things, but wait one there. Wait, I wrote it wrong. In the beginning we're like, oh, let's just make it vague until we discover, but as an idea we want, like, I wanted to ask you also, what do you think if we leave it a little bit vague, but then we have the discourse part where we write things that are more in depth, and then we can have them differentiated, like discourses on museums, discourses on art, discourses on history, and so then we can have a bigger space to expand.
But I think to be able to get different, because discourses, and to know exactly, you need to expand the first minute, the provoking. I understand that you make it vague because also it's nice to provoke people in conversation by that, provoke them to take what's their discourse about, what they create about it by making a lines. But in the same time, I think expanding it could actually, you get to, even though I understand the fear of you changing directions, we all change directions idea, but also this is part of your concept, is when you change directions, you change also your concept. And then you come and say, this was our concept and was our new concept. And somehow this is presenting of movement itself, is also your concept itself, like, because we don't want it to present one idea as we also developed. We encounter something new that changes our ideas about how we look at history, museology, and all of this stuff. Our ideological framework is all the time expanding based on the impact and the theoretical impact of the people we have a conversation with, the books that we read. And in the same time, we also have our firm position of how we look and discuss with people critically, and we also have our book critically. This is actually have to be, but there's a certain point that you need this manifesto to be more expanded, to include more people in the conversation, to provoke more people to come and talk to you about it.